had the COVID crisis, we had the energy crisis. Those were two moments where on the European level there was a bit of a loosening of state aid rules. And some countries used those opportunity to try to attract industrial end consumers to their countries.
But we've seen over the past decade and even 5 years that the energy market and landscapes have changed a lot. How do you see this affecting clients?
We actually come from a relatively easy period. When we go back to the state of regulated markets, it was straightforward. You had your energy bill, you had your tariff, your consumption, and that was about it. But a lot of countries moved into a deregulated situation, and that added complexity to the energy bill. And they moved from a centralized production park for electricity generation into a decentralized. A lot of that was renewable assets coming online, and they were at that moment in time not very mature. So that meant that at that moment in time, subsidies were involved. The disadvantage of that decision was that that gave us higher energy prices, mostly on the non-commodity, and that countries then started to make decisions to give reductions, exemptions to whole group of consumers or certain targeted group of consumers, and that brought another layer of complexity into that energy bills.
So usually regulation evolution will be applied on a national or federal level, while when we look at large multinational companies, they operate in multiple countries.
What we see there is some sort of competition that starts to arise. On one hand, for example, between Europe and US, we saw that with the IRA, where they then made the decision to give subsidies in the US, but also within the European Union, we see competition between member states. We had the COVID crisis, we had the energy crisis. Those were two moments where on the European level, there was a bit of a loosening of state aid rules. And some countries used those opportunity to try to attract industrial end consumers to their countries.
What is the impact that we see on companies in changes in regulation and the competition between countries?
Yeah, so for industrial companies, it's then important to create for themselves, first of all, knowledge on what regulation is changing and also visibility. You see certain dynamics appearing. A decision taken in one country triggers another country to take a similar decision or to react on that. So that's where that visibility and that knowledge really comes in for themselves. Ideally, they have that for their own production assets, for the plants that they're active in or the countries that they're active in themselves, but also for their competitors, for example. It's always interesting and important to know my competitors are operating in another country. Does this give them an advantage or a disadvantage versus where I'm operating?
Considering this, it means as a company, you would need to have a lot of knowledge of in-house metrics, like consumption data, for example, how your invoices work.
You start with the data. What consumption do I have? What countries am I active in? What energy costs do I have? And then you have the luxury of being able to compare countries with each other. But it's really that data that gives you insight for your decision making. Now, what we see in the energy transition that is going on is the granularity of information and data that is needed, that it's getting lower and lower. Before you had, let's say, one change per year, and now we see changes appearing each quarter, each month. And what we then see is in some regulation, like for example, the recently adapted hydrogen regulation, it brings that down to an hourly level, for example, as of 2027, really bringing your data to a lower granularity, to that hourly level, 50-minute level, will be key going forward into the future, because we see some legislative processes going into that direction.
I think it's interesting also to look at it under the perspective of industries relocating to different countries to avoid certain type of regulation.
Yeah, we start to see there a bit of a chain of action and reaction. On the European level, there was recently this Antwerp Declaration of the European Industrial Deal, where then within the European framework, they try to say, let's make sure that we can keep some of that industry in Europe. And what can we do to make sure that we have an industrial deal, similar to what we had as a Green Deal some years ago, an industrial deal to keep being competitive from a European perspective. Obviously, you can't forecast and predict, just like you can't do it with energy markets, you can't do it with regulation. There is a political process involved. We have elections where you don't know the outcome, and we have events like COVID, like an energy crisis, where you don't know what that will mean. What we have seen, both of us during COVID and the energy crisis, is that there was a very strong increase in the number of regulatory interventions from governments. And that is an unpredictable dynamic. However, you try to make sure that you stay close to the reality and that you track those changes at the moment they are there, that you then can decide and react on what you want to do with that.